My name is William Fraher. I'm a local historian and artist born in Dungarvan. My family have been here for quite a long time. My father worked in the Dungarvan leather factory as the security guard. So we have a long connection with Dungarvan, and I've been interested in the history of the town, every aspect of it since I was very young.
And your mother, what was her background?
She's Waterford City, Condon from Waterford.
All right. She's not into the by soldier?
No, I've been asked that before, but there isn't, as far as I know, there isn't a link.
Okay. And where did they meet then?
They met here in Dungarvan, as far as I know.
Okay.
But her family were involved with shipping and feelings as well. That was the other connection in Waterford City. So still researching all of that family history.
Oh, okay. And obviously you are the main historian here and everything. So I want to ask you different questions about different parts of the story. Now, you know the film is going to be kind of centred around Grattan Square. So maybe you could start with that and tell us how that came about.
Yes, it's a very interesting, it's a very important example of 19th century town planning. And it's the origin of it also is interesting. It revolves around the influence of the Duke of Devonshire, who was the major landowner in Dungarvan. They were beginning to lose power and decided, well, I wonder if there's anything we can do to influence people in Dungarvan to vote for our candidate in the election. So somebody thought up of an idea, why don't we do a big building project? So you will have people who will be supplying materials, people who will be able to buy houses, and it will transform Dungarvan. We'll build a new marketplace, and surely this will result in votes for the Duke's candidate. And of course it wasn't quite as simple as that, but it was a major plan because the entire project over a number of years cost something like £70,000. And this is from about 1803 to early 1820s. So they decided to go ahead with the plan, and a man called William Atkinson, an architect, an English architect, who had already done work for the Duke at Lismore Castle, was employed to come up with the designs. The supervisor engineer for the project was a man called Jesse Hartley. Now he's particularly interesting because he is the man who built the famous dock complex in Liverpool. And while he was in Dungarvan, he married a local girl called Ellen Penny, and they're actually commemorated on her family's tombstone at St Mary's Church of Ireland. So he sort of started off his career, I suppose you could say, in Dungarvan, overseeing the building of the bridge and designing the quays. So it was an enormous project. It's interesting, they had created their own brickworks on the Coniger and at the Spring in Dungarvan. So a lot of the bricks were handmade here. But there is a comment that the Irish materials were inferior, so they decided to import Portland stone for fireplaces and other material from England. So we're very lucky that there's a very detailed archive of the Devonshire papers. So I've been researching that over the years. The project did go along in stages. The bridge, again, is interesting because the stone for that came from Runcorn in Cheshire, and it was all carved. Almost complete bridge came like a kit. And we have a record of it arriving at the quay and the agent coming to examine all of this stonework. And there are all kinds of stories about the bridge, that they used blankets in the construction. You still find these stories in Dungarvan. And there are comments that the agent said, we will charge our political rivals to travel over the bridge. Another important thing was they also created a water pump on the square. There was no proper fresh water supply, so they decided to sink a well and discovered fresh water, and which was great for the people of Dungarvan. Previous to this, it came in from an area outside Dungarvan called the Spring. So it arrived in a guy in a donkey cart with barrels of water and brought it around the town, and you purchased your water from him. And the project itself, it involved, as I say, building a new marketplace, which is on the site of the former post office opposite Lawler's Hotel. And again, it was for fish and meat, and the people who sold produce in the market were called the Joulters, which is a particular name in Dungarvan. There's actually a field outside Dungarvan called Joulters Field. And really, I suppose it's a name for a sort of nickname for a hawker or seller of produce. The actual market on the square, while we have drawings by Samson Roach, which are very important, in the early 1820s, he did a sketchbook of drawings of ordinary people of Waterford City and Dungarvan. So you have the apple seller and the woman selling seaweed, somebody selling bread, and these are very important drawings. And these presumably were sketched around the square, but it didn't become a formal marketplace until the 1860s. The actual marketplace was outside the present art centre on the main street. So the Duke of Devonshire gave permission in the 1860s to move the market to the square. So that's when it really takes off, because the other problem with Main Street is it's quite a small area. So the whole market developed when it moved to the square, and there are some wonderful later photographs in the late 19th century by Lawrence, and it shows sort of very lively scene, and the women in the cloaks and shawls, you know. Of course, these are all in black and white, which makes the Samson Roach drawings very important because they're actually watercolours. So we have colour, you can see the wonderful array of colours and clothing, and how many women are smoking pipes, which is very interesting in these drawings. And it's great we've been able to incorporate some of these images into the new plaques which have been inset around the square. The other important aspect of the square was it was a natural gathering place. So whenever you had a political meeting, the square was the natural place. So throughout the 19th century, you had Parnell and various other figures, Michael Collins at a later period, who gave a speech from the back of a lorry, which is a famous incident, and the lorry was driven off, and he may have died in Dungarvan, except for the quick thinking of some people. And we actually have a photograph in the collection showing the immediate aftermath of that event, with an enormous crowd in the square all looking off towards Bridge Street, wondering what's happened to Michael Collins. But anyway, it all worked out okay in the end, and he came back and gave his speech from the balcony of the Devonshire Arms Hotel. So we have a number of pictures in our collection showing these political meetings. So throughout that whole period, and then right into the modern period, I remember myself seeing Bernadette Devlin giving a political speech, and you had Jack Lynch, and again we have a number of photographs in the museum collection showing these events. So it was used, constantly for events, and it's still used as the central point for the St. Patrick's Day Parade, and the judging stage is set up.
I saw on the on the photo archive the stage for the political talks seemed to be in front of the Enterprise Bar. Is that it?
That's where I remember, yes. But I think probably in different photographs it can be in different locations, but that's actually where I remember myself as a boy saying some of those speeches in that particular space.
And there was one too in the archive which was about the centenary of the emancipation of Catholics. A big procession going through the square.
Yes,
like 1929 or something, or whatever it was.
Yes, the other event, they also held the Eucharistic Processions. And again, we have wonderful photographs showing these from an earlier period into the 50s and beyond. And a special altar would have been constructed on the square. And there are also, from another period, you have the volunteers, the Dungarvan volunteers, a great band of men all marching around the square.
What was that? What year was that?
That's 1914 period.
All right.
So it's used for all kinds of different events.
So these would be Redmond's
Yes.
volunteers.
Yes.
Before,
And you also have recruiting meetings which were held in the square.
with the British Army.
Yeah, yes, and you have speeches by military people and military bands, and Claude Anson from Ballysaggertmore, who was a recruiting agent, and he had sent a circular to the Dungarvan Urban Council saying, we want to increase your recruiting efforts, and they say, no, we're not going to do any more. 800 men have left from Dungarvan, which was a substantial amount, and we feel we can't do any more. So that's another interesting period where people seem to be supportive, or at least the majority of the time, and I think it's really after the execution of the leaders in 1916 that the whole attitude begins to change, and there's a much more...
I also saw a photograph of the goat cart racing. Do you
Oh,
remember that?
no, I don't remember.
All right.
I don't remember that. No.
But just the whole thing about the relationship between the Protestant minority and the Catholic majority in Dungarvan, I mean, that looks like a very interesting story.
It is. Dungarvan had a very high Catholic population. I think one of the highest of all the Munster towns, and the Protestant population was, really tiny, and that whole issue came to the fore with the reconstruction of Dungarvan by the Duke of Devonshire, because at the same time the Catholics were planning a new church, and they picked a site at the top of Mary Street, very, very elevated. It could be seen from all over, and this church was going to be the same size as the Catholic Cathedral in Waterford, which was very ambitious. So when I was researching the Devonshire correspondence, I came across letters from the agent in Dungarvan saying, these Catholics are going to build this enormous church, and you must refuse permission because it will upset all our Protestant friends and make their church look puny in comparison, which isn't. It's situated quite close. But the sixth Duke, William Spencer Cavendish, when he succeeded, he was quite sympathetic to Catholic emancipation. He actually did grant the land to build the church, and also contributed money towards the building. So the project went ahead, and it was a very expensive project, and it went on for quite a number of years. But Daniel O'Connell, when he visited Dungarvan, before 1826, he gave his speech from the scaffolding against the unfinished building. But it was a very ambitious building, as I say, for its time, but was never completed. The tower and steeple, they obviously never managed to raise enough funds, and the project was revived in the 1870s, and there's actually a drawing for this enormous tower and steeple, which was going to be situated facing down Mary Street. So it would have been very dramatic. You come into the square, you look straight ahead, and you would have seen this enormous Gothic tower and steeple. But like a lot of these projects, it never materialised.
Ran out of money.
Yes.
And just to go back to the square, wasn't there talk about it being a very square?
Well, that's not actually true, because if you look at it on a proper plan, because when they created the square, the section towards Mary Street, that was actually a part of the main street houses, so they effectively had to knock through and demolish a whole group of houses, so that you could then create Mary Street itself leading up to the church. So there's a sort of kink in the layout. It's not a perfect square.
Okay.
But it was more unified than it is now, because at the top of each house you had a cut stone, a limestone parapet, which sort of unified the whole. And at some point, I suspect in the 1820s, they were unfinished plots and developers took them on and did slightly different window heights and divided buildings into two. So while it's initially you think it's all uniform, there are variations in window heights. But the plan was to have it looking as a completely planned, with everything, windows all at the same level and the entire thing. They did have a slightly different arrangement at the entrance from Bridge Street, where you had buildings with an extra story and they were more formal. And now we don't know, they may have been planning to have one of those at the end of Mary Street, so you would have had 4 of these matching buildings, which would have been impressive. But again, I suspect money ran out, and somebody probably said, this project isn't really doing much for your political supporters, so really I think you stop spending money on Dungarvan.
And I'm not sure which of the Dukes of Devonshire, but you were saying before to me that they were quite great collectors of art.
Well, this man, William Spencer Cavendish, who was known as the Bachelor Duke, now he was the man who was the mentor of Joseph Paxton, who designed the Crystal Palace and came to Lismore, and it's Paxton who is responsible for the present look of Lismore Castle. Turning it into this sort of dramatic fairy tale castle. But what's very interesting about it is Paxton was very careful to keep as much of the original fabric. And when you look at the great tower, when you come into Lismore over the bridge and you see that great corner tower, he has actually knitted in the masonry right on to the 17th century towers, and you can see where the original masonry meets his. And it's wonderfully done, and very neatly done. So I suspect the Duke must have said, can you preserve as much of my ancestral castle as possible? And so Paxton was a remarkable man, really. So that the Duke was very fond of art, and the family seat at Chatsworth is full of objects that he collected, and he was a great buyer of Canova's sculptures. And there are letters from the Duke's accountants saying, please stop spending money, you have already spent too much. And these are colossal sums, and this money has to come from the rental of lands in England and Ireland. And so these things, I suppose, didn't concern the owners. They just spent and thought the money will come from somewhere. But we have an earlier echo of that in the architect the Earl of Burlington, who built Chiswick House. Again, he sold off in the early 18th century several of the Irish lands in order to finance his building and art collecting. So there's a great tradition in the Cavendish family of buying and supporting artists and architects and sculptors, for centuries, and it's still happening today.
Amazing. And come here, there was also talk about the Devonshires being probably better landlords than many others around the country at the time of evictions and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, there is evidence that they were more supportive and reduced rents, and also Joanne Rothwell, the county archivist, has researched some of the books where they have assisted people, for emigration, and would give them financial assistance. So in a number of fields, they seem to have been, quite good in supporting people. In comparison, say, to Kylie Usher of Ballysaggertmore, who's the typical sort of nasty, evil landlord, and who's still remembered to this very day, which is amazing, who evicted people wholesale off his estates and sort of said, there's the workhouse to Lismore, and I'll pay you to demolish your own house. And the reason we know so much about him is that a reporter came from the Cork Examiner and covered that entire story. So you have these contrasts between the different landlords, and also the Villiers-Stewart family of Dromana were benevolent. Again, they had a good reputation which remained with them. And when the Board of Guardians were looking for a site for a graveyard during the famine, they were using the medieval graveyard of Kilrush just outside Dungarvan. But they were burying so many people, their dogs were digging out the bodies. So they said, we have to do something about this. And they advertised for land, and only one reply, and that was from the Henry Villiers-Stewart of Dromana. So he gave a piece of ground out at Pulla, which is near the Shanachie pub, and that became the principal burial ground during the famine. And that's where there are countless. We have no record of how many people were buried out there. While those, I suppose you could say, lucky or unlucky to be inmates of the workhouse, they had a very tough and harsh regime, but they were given basic food rations. And from our research, the numbers of deaths within the workhouse weren't high. There were deaths there, but people were just fed just enough to keep them going. So you had a much better chance, even though you were in this very harsh regime, where women and girls were separated from the men and boys. But it's a whole area we have researched in our book on the famine in Dungarvan. So they had their roles within the workhouse, and shoemaking, and the girls would be doing sewing and lace making, and the men breaking stones. But a very harsh existence. Again, we have rough numbers. We don't know how many, or we don't know who the people who were admitted to the workhouse, because the admission books are no longer preserved. So we're all the time finding out more facts.
There seems to be very little records of famine, isn't there, in Ireland, generally, like?
I suppose the main sources would be sort of correspondence that's held in the National Archives, these various relief committees. We have a letter on display in the display case behind me for the Kilgobnet Relief Committee. These were set up all over the country. Local concerned people, and just organising themselves and saying, what can we do, and setting up soup kitchens and that sort of thing. And what we do have, there are a number of subscription lists which were printed up. And these are interesting because you can see who were the local people who gave everything from a shilling up to £10, And so a number of these were published, and they're preserved in various archives. So it gives you an idea of what people in the locality were contributing. And people have often commented, why didn't they just give people grain and open the grain stores? One of the grain merchants in Dungarvan was Andrew Carberry, but he was also on the relief committee, and he was helping the poor. But his attitude would probably have been, if I open my doors, my business would be ruined. I will have to let all the men go. They will have no income. They will then have to bring their family to the workhouse. So it's not quite as simple as we might think. So you have all the heroes, and you have clergy on both sides, Church of Ireland and Catholic, who we know from the record were helping people, and who also died of fever themselves. So there was a united effort. And at various times, Dungarvan was particularly bad. And one of the accounts we came across said it rivals Skibbereen. And Skibbereen is a classic case of it was extreme, what was happening there during the famine period. But that was also the case here. And you have, in the middle of the whole thing, you have the launch of a schooner, which is remarkable. You have people dying and a woman going around the square with her son's body in the back of a horse and cart saying, will somebody give me money for a coffin? And you find there's a ship being launched. Because that shipbuilder and owner, Mr. Mahoney, employed a whole lot of people, and that kept them alive and, kept their families in the workhouse. So we kind of imagine, I suppose, everything came to a standstill, but life still continued on.
Private enterprise.
Yes. There's always that element, we'll do so much, but we're not going to jeopardize our businesses. So it's very interesting.
And usually in Waterford City, they talk about the Quakers. And we said Quakers and the Christian brothers got together to feed the city and blah, blah, blah. That's the story that we hear down in Waterford City. Was there anything like that up this way?
The Quakers were also involved in Dungarvan, particularly in Ring, where the local vicar contacted them. And they really were really significant for the people of Ring, because they gave them grants for fishing gear, also gave, I suppose, financial incentives if you kept your house and farm in order. And it was such an important help to the people of Ring that effectively the fishing industry moved from Dungarvan out to Ring. And really that became the centre. And it never recovered really in Dungarvan fully after that period. So they're a very significant contribution. They were also in Dungarvan as well, but I think they're actually remembered still. It's still remembered in Ring, that connection. And we've had events to commemorate that, and Joan Johnson in Waterford has researched and spoken about it. And Nicholas Graves also in Ring has been involved in, keeping that story alive. And I think there's a great appreciation of the work that the Quakers did in that period up in West Waterford.
I was going to ask you about the fishing industry, because someone told us at one stage there was like 3,000 people working in fishing between all the different industries. I don't know.
Yes, you had the men were out fishing, you had the women and the children were involved in gutting fish and processing fish, and the fish was salted. There are records of salted fish in the 18th century in Lisbon and in France, merchants coming across barrels and barrels of Dungarvan hake. That was the famous fish being exported, and it was a particular delicacy, dried hake from Dungarvan. And again, it's a whole subject matter that we've been researching for years, and trying to research those links with the continent, because I think we forget that so much was done by boat and connections by sea, and to quite distant places, and everything was done by boat. And there was a complete network of connections between merchants and their families all over Europe and beyond. And these links were used to, if somebody was going abroad, you would have a letter of introduction. So it was a way of getting a foothold in whatever country you were going to. So it's, there's a lot of material spread around archives, which is being worked on by various historians. So we now have a much better picture than we did, say, 20 years ago. about all of this maritime history, but it's absolutely fascinating, and we're coming up with new material all the time.
It's amazing. And just, we also came across a famous poem by John Betjeman, which might be no harm for, could you put it into context, like how he ended up here?
Yes, the Irish Unionists' farewell to Greta Hellstrom in 1922. Of course, it wasn't written in 1922, needless to say, it was much later. But when the poem was published, it puzzled people like Philip Larkin, the poet, said, what is this about? Who is Greta Hellstrom, and why is Dungarvan the location? But Betjeman was rather coy about it and never really explained the background to the poem. And of course, Greta Hellstrom is a completely made-up name, and it refers to Emily Villiers-Stewart, who had been married to Lord Hempel, and she herself was Emily Sears. She was an American socialite and beauty and a great horsewoman, and she met her husband, Lord Hempel, when she was riding her horse through the Borghese Gardens in Rome, and I think had an accident, and he came to her rescue, and then they were married. But he was an alcoholic, so she decided divorce. And John Betjeman met her, and I think was besotted, yet another of the women that he fell in love with. But she decided it would be just platonic, and she married Ein Villiers-Stewart of Dramana. But John Betjeman used to meet her at Dramana House, and also at a house that the Villiers-Stewart family had out in Ring, known as the Yellow House. And this was on the cliff at Helvig. So there are letters in the Betjeman archive written on Dramana headed notepaper from Emily Villiers-Stewart, but she has crossed out Dramana and she's written in Helvig Lodge, Ring. So the poem is really about her. And in the 1980s, a Dungarvan lady actually wrote to John Betjeman and said, what is this poem about? And he said, yes, it did take place in Dungarvan, and I did meet a lady there, but he didn't reveal the identity at that time. But we now know from the Villiers-Stewart family that Emily was the subject of the poem. And the other important thing is he mentions the statue and the square. There was never a statue in the square in Dungarvan, but maybe we should have one.
There was a pump house.
There was the pump that I mentioned that the Villiers-Stewart, that the pump that the Duke of Devonshire had erected. And at a later period we had the Way Bridge and Way House, which was constructed of timber originally and then more solid materials, which was removed in the late 50s.
And John Betjeman, he was stationed in Dublin, wasn't he?
He was the press attaché for the British ambassador from 1941 to 43. So he met a lot of literary and historic figures while he was in Ireland. He also tried to learn Irish while he was here. And of course, his most famous Irish poem, Ireland with Emily, involves Emily Villiers-Stewart. She went on a cycling trip around the Burn and said, you must see this wonderful ruined house called Tyrone House, built by the St. George family. And the house is said to have been built by Waterford architect John Roberts, another Waterford link. And nearby was the St. George family mausoleum. And of course this all features in the poem by Betjeman. So she's responsible for the creation of that poem, I suppose you could say.
Was that period when he was coming down to this area, 41 to 43?
Yes, but he was also in Ireland in the 1930s, because in England he developed friendships with people like Lord Longford, and he had a particular interest and fascination with, I suppose, the landed gentry and the aristocracy, and he was often pursuing some aristocratic girl. And I think he was fascinated by that whole world of the big house and the country house. So he developed great friendships. And when he was in Ireland, he was always talking about houses. And Terence de Vere White actually says that Betjeman showed them, a new appreciation in Irish buildings and architecture, because that was one of his, as well as being a poet, he was a great champion of architecture, and particularly Victorian architecture, which in the 70s was completely gone out of fashion, and he sort of rekindled people's interest in this and got people interested in architectural history. So he had a wide influence, not just through his poetry. And while he wasn't too happy when you read his letters, while he was in Ireland, I think he did enjoy it. But he did have a sort of funny joke. He used to sign his personal letters, Sean O'Betchamon, to his friends in England. I don't know what the censor would have made of that. But anyway, nevertheless, I think his poems, they're very evocative, and certainly I think Ireland with Emily, and of course Dungarvan in the Rain, we're very proud of that one.
And there's something else I want to say about John Betjeman now, what was it? Well, there was a story too about the IRA at one point.
He was to be the subject of an assassination attempt, and at a point years later, one of the Republicans wrote him a letter saying, "Dear Mr. Betjeman, you might not know this, but we were going to kill you." And but one of the Republicans, very taken by your poetry. So, and I believe they particularly singled out his poem about Slough. There's a line saying, "Let the bombs fall on Slough." They took this to mean he was a supporter of Germany and their attack on England. This is the story. Now, I suspect Betjeman enjoyed that whole idea that he might have been assassinated. So we have no concrete evidence that was the case.
You did say that he was also a great one for the whole thing about the environment and conservation and stuff like that.
Oh, yes. Well, he even when you read the poems, for instance, that one, Ireland with Emily, there's a wonderful evocation of the wild plants in the countryside and the stone walls. And, I think he's able to evoke that if it's an urban setting or somewhere else. And he's able to evoke a whole period or a particular, I suppose, social strata in society as well. And I think the poems were often misunderstood as being, I suppose, a sarcastic commentary, but I think his point was he wanted to highlight the ordinary and show how extraordinary it was. Mm-hmm. That would be my take on it.
Okay, and just before we finish, just a few things about, we were talking about, you mentioned about your father worked as a security man at the leather factory. Could you say something about the leather factory?
It was a very important industry because it was the first real industry, I suppose, apart from Dungarvan Co-op. And the factory was established in the 1930s, and it became a major employer. So they expanded and took over a whole series of warehouses and buildings around the area of the present Arts Centre and where the Tannery restaurant is in the castle. So you had quite a big complex there and employing a lot of people, and it's a subject that Eddie Cantwell has recently researched in detail. So very important. You had two main industries, the co-op and the leather factory, for many, many years. So they were vital to the economy of Dungarvan.
And the leather factory was a private enterprise. I mean, it was the Irish Leather, or whatever.
It was the Dickens Leather Company. Was the original title.
And the co-op then, was that owned by the farmers, or how?
It was the co-op. They actually bought out. There was a co-op initially, and then they bought out Shandon Dairy and combined the whole complex. And of course it grew and grew. And you had a whole lot of satellite dairies outside of Dungarvan. And this was all developed into a very successful industry. And of course now the site is completely gone as if it never existed. But we do have records and photographs, and it's something we're very keen to do, is to build up a collection about the industries of Dungarvan. We've got a good archive on the leather factory and also on the Dungarvan crystal. These are all industries now which are completely gone, and most of the buildings associated with them. So we're very conscious of that, so we're constantly collecting material relating to industries and what might seem relatively recent periods in history, but they will become interesting in future years.